Hey guys, how you doing? Luna here with a new video. Welcome back to the channel. Today I am really excited because we're talking about a topic that's really well known among Beatle fans. Because it's really easy to watch all the recent interviews and documentaries about the Beatles and think that the band members always shared a loving relationship and they were always in good terms. However, if you know enough about the Beatles, you know that towards the end of their career as a band, the relationship was a little tense and the band members clashed quite often, which led to them breaking up by the late 60s. And actually, the breakup is one of the messiest and most well media covered breakup that any band has had in the history of music. But no clash was as covered by the media and as well documented as the one that John Lennon and Paul McCartney had in the early 70s, with songs like I Found Out and How Do You Sleep by John Lennon in his first two albums, and then Paul McCartney retaliating with the song Too Many People in Ram back in 1971. They pioneered a lot of good things in music, you know, the heavier versions of rock in tracks like Your Blues and Helter Skelter. Then you also have the psychedelic movement being popularized by the Beatles. But another thing that they also popularized was beefing, you know, because that's basically what they had in the early 70s. They were writing songs to each other. And overall, John was always very open about his criticism of a lot of things, including Paul McCartney's discography and songwriting style, because a lot of people seem to believe that John Lennon didn't really like the way Paul wrote music after the Revolver sessions. Many people say that when it comes to Sgt. Pepper's and every album that came after that, they were kind of disconnected from each other in terms of like songwriting creativity, writing music that was totally different from what the other had in mind. And that's the reason why, starting from Sgt. Pepper's, you don't really see John Lennon and Paul McCartney collaborating on a lot of songs. Because back in the day, in the early years or the Beatlemania years, Paul McCartney and John Lennon rarely wrote a song without each other. Almost every composition from that era, except songs like Yesterday and You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, for example, have both credited as the songwriters. And while a lot of people seem to believe that this is just because of some contract or some things like that, you know, some legal stuff, the real reason is because they actually wrote the songs together. Even if one of them had the, you know, the basis of the song already done, the other always contributed with a lot of ideas and sounds and things he wanted to add to the track. That is the reason why people believe that Lennon-McCartney is the best songwriting duo of all time, because they were really good complementing each other in the early years of the Beatles. However, once you get past Revolver, and actually many people argue that even in Revolver it was kind of more about individuality, you find that they participated in each other's track more as a band member rather than a co-songwriter. You can see that in tracks like When I'm 64 and Lovely Rita. In the case of John Lennon, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Good Morning, Good Morning. And even in tracks like A Day in the Life, you find that John has a piece of the song and then Paul has another piece in it. It's not like a team effort. It's more like when you both make a project and put it together. And yes, the song is amazing, one of the greatest songs of all time. But when you compare that songwriting partnership with the one they had prior, it's obvious that it's not the same. This, along with the beef they had in the early 70s and some innocent comments John made after this entire thing happened, led a lot of people to believe that they weren't really friends and that John didn't really like the way that Paul did music. While Paul was never really too open about criticism on John Lennon's music, he always criticized his ideals more than anything and his way to carry the entire breakup, basically blaming him for the Beatles breakup. And mind you, I'm aware that John was the first to leave the band, but I think it's pretty safe to say that by that time the band wasn't really a band anymore. It was four songwriters releasing music under one name, and that's not really a band, is it? However, when we thought that the whole beef with Paul McCartney and John Lennon was over, Paul McCartney released a song in 1976 called Silly Love Song. It was a single for the Wings album, Wings at the Speed of Sound. It's one of his most popular songs, and it actually went #1 in the US, and a lot of people seem to believe that it was a direct shot at John Lennon and his comments about him, because the song overall is basically him mocking all the comments of him only making love songs and making songs that are way too simple with no complexity and no interesting factor to it. Even though this is a complete lie, and I'll get to that in a minute, it's also true that Paul McCartney was the more commercial side of the Beatles. John Lennon was always more risky and, raw when it comes to his ideas, putting them on paper, which led to him making songs like Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey, Your Blues. You also have Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Tomorrow Never Knows, songs that if you compare the Paul McCartney counterparts like Eleanor Rigby, Here, There, and Everywhere, When I'm 64, Lovely Rita, it's obvious that John had the more interesting and complex side. It's pretty safe to say that Paul focused more on the commercial side of music. One could argue that this is because he was always better at singing the songs as well. His voice was more melodic, the tune of his voice was more enjoyable. It's like candy to your ears. Paul McCartney is one of my favorite performers of all time, so you could argue that the reason why John Lennon couldn't or really didn't do the songs is because his voice doesn't really fit them, but that's a whole different topic that I'm not going to get into right now. The point is that because of the nature of the song Silly Love Songs, a lot of people thought that it was a song about John Lennon's comments, and this rumor came about saying that John Lennon said that Paul McCartney only wrote silly love songs on an interview, insulting his way of writing music and ignoring a really big part of his discography like Ram or Wildlife, where he actually experimented with a lot of different sounds. John did say once that Paul McCartney enjoyed doing granny music. However, he refers to songs like Honey Pie, in which there's a little funny story behind it. You know, the little guitar solo at the end of the song, that was actually John Lennon trying to adorn the track because he didn't really like the style of the song and he wasn't too sure about including it in the Wine album. This part of Paul McCartney, the part that likes old school music, the type of music he grew up listening to, that John was never really a fan of. However, he was only talking about that part of Paul McCartney's songwriting style. Often he praised Paul for a lot of songs he did, both in the Beatles and as a solo artist. People like to quote things he said about the track Hello Goodbye, saying that he never was a fan of Paul McCartney's writing style when it comes to the commercial side of the band. However, this was only because the song did better than I Am the Walrus, which is by far a way better song. You know, it's more complicated. It definitely falls on the experimental side of the band. That's always a more interesting one than the one Paul presented in songs like Lovely Rita and When I'm 64. Obviously, if you listen to those songs and then you go to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds or A Day in Life, which songs do you like the most? You know, it's pretty obvious that John's side of the experimental side of the Beatles is more interesting overall and more thought-provoking, while Paul is only there to adorn the album with, you know, what's radio acceptable. What I'm trying to say here is that John didn't really think that Hello Goodbye was a bad song overall. He was just saying that for him, it's shocking that a track like Hello Goodbye is above I Am the Walrus in the charts and overall in the people's opinion. If anything, Paul was a little more critical about John's work, especially if you go to the mid-70s album he was never really a fan of. He was more a fan of his early stuff, even if he has diss tracks towards him in them, and also the things he did at the end of his career. He always thought it was wholesome to see John in such a married life state with Yoko and his kids, you know, and as fans we always look at albums like Milk and Honey and Double Fantasy as that, John finally finding peace and finding happiness in his relationship and as a father. So really, when you go back to the 60s and the 70s and, you know, go through all these interviews and go through all these quotes, most of the time both Paul and John only had praises for each other. They shared a songwriting partnership that lasted years and that gave us one of the greatest discographies of all time. So obviously they spoke very highly of each other, and when they didn't, it was mostly because they were fed up with questions. Imagine going on your own, enjoying your life with your family, doing projects as a solo artist, and then when you go to interviews, people only seem to ask you about the Beatles. Obviously, it's tiresome. You know, they wanted to grow out of the Beatles. It's not that they didn't like those years in the Beatles. It's just that they were trying to enjoy their years as a solo artist, and they couldn't because the shadow of the Beatles were always chasing them, especially John Lennon, with the constant questions of, you know, are the Beatles going to get back together? It kind of ignoring the political side of John Lennon that he was really trying to push through in the early 70s. But it seems like every time he did one of those interviews, every single question was about the Beatles, which was obviously tiring him out and led him to answer not as positively as in, you know, other interviews deeper into the 70s. But this specific comment where John Lennon says that Paul McCartney only writes silly love songs never really happened. Actually, when they asked Paul McCartney about this song and what it was about, he said that it was about critics and all these people saying that he only knows how to do love songs. And, you know, even though this is not true, Ram, White Life, Band on the Run are albums that are deeply experimental at its core. When you look at songs like Monkberry Moon Delight, Ram On, The Backseat of My Car, yes, some of these songs are love songs. However, that doesn't really mean that they're not experimental, because what's wrong with a love song? You know, a love song can be experimental. And actually, when you look at John Lennon's career, even though in the Beatles he was the experimental side of the band, along with George Harrison with some, you know, Asian influences in his music. Once you get past that, and Plastic Ono Band, because Plastic Ono Band is also very experimental when it comes to performance, it's one of the most influential albums ever, but Imagine wasn't really all that influential. Sometime in New York City, maybe with the lyrical themes John was touching was experimental, but the music wasn't really all that crazy. And when you go to Mind Games, the same thing. Walls and Bridges, the same thing. Rock and Roll is literally a covers album, and then you go all the way up to Double Fantasy, which once more, it's one of the most simple albums John has ever wrote. So I don't really understand when people say that John Lennon was extremely experimental, this experimental genius in his solo discography, when it's not really true at all. You know, Paul McCartney with albums like Ram and Wildlife and McCartney 2, oh my god, he was way more experimental, or at least took many more risks. That's not true once you dive deep into the 80s and the 90s and especially 2000s, but you know, for the most part, when it comes to the 70s, Paul McCartney was more experimental than John. So I think that most people that say this are just trying to find a way to create this gap between the two and act as if the Beatle years wasn't really all that enjoyable, because I think that people find this topics to be interesting, and it entertains this saddest part of their brains that wants to cause trouble, want controversy, you know. And when they look that Paul McCartney has nothing but good things to say about John Lennon, they are kind of disappointed, you know. But Beatle fans, real Beatle fans, especially the ones that know about the history of the band, know that they loved each other and that they had a lot of respect for each other. And yes, their relationship got kind of turbulent towards the end of the band's career, but after all the lawsuits, after all the comments made against each other, they went back to being friends, maybe not as close as they were before, but that's okay, that's fine. People grow old, people make new friends, people get married and have kids, you know, and when all these things happen, you tend to grow away from people, and that's perfectly fine. In my opinion, that doesn't really take away all the years you spent with these people enjoying life together, you know. And at the end of the day, for me, no one can explain this better than Paul McCartney himself, so please.
And that's a very special picture for me, actually, because when the Beatles broke up, a lot of the talk was that, like, I was the villain and that John and I didn't really get on well. And there was a lot of down talk about it because, you know, everyone was sad the Beatles had broken up. And I kind of bought into it. I thought...
That you were the villain?
A little bit, you know, because when you're called it enough, you start thinking, well, maybe I was, you know. So I had to do a lot of sort of wrangling with, was I, wasn't I? Did I know John? Were we friends and anything, you know? Knowing really we were, but there were so many rumors about it. And that photo, when I saw that, it's like, yes, we were friends. And it's a beautiful photo for me because it just reminds me of us working together and how cool it was.
That'll be it for today's video, guys. I really hope that you enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the videos that I upload. Please remember that this is only my personal opinion, so if you have your own, and I'm pretty sure you do, go ahead and leave a comment down below and I'll make sure to check it out, and you can have my opinion on your opinion. Also, if you guys want me to talk about any other topics, if you guys want me to make a review of an album or check out a certain song, you can go ahead and leave your request down below in the comments and I'll make sure to fulfill it as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you guys enjoyed it, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.